Good.
Thank you everyone for coming out. This is Left Bank Books. I'm Jeff Shervin, and we're all very excited to hear tonight from Mark Guarino, who will be discussing Country and Midwestern Chicago and the history of country music and folk revival. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you shop at Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the pockets of local St. Louis individuals like myself, who have sworn to never shop at the Devil's Warehouse, also known as Jeff Bezos' rocket ship fund, also known as Amazon.
Yes.
Shopping local means keeping brick and mortar stores open. It means keeping the streets paved, libraries funded, our parks free, and keeping our children safe from the clutches of diabolical billionaires. Thank you for your support. As I mentioned, I'm Jeff Shervin. I'm a bookseller here. Tonight, I'm covering for Shane Mullen, the usual event coordinator, who I think is staying home listening to country music and folk. Time to introduce tonight's speakers. Mark Guarino covers national news and culture from Chicago for the Washington Post, ABC News, the New York Times, and other outlets. He was the Midwest bureau chief for the Christian Science Monitor for 7 years. And for more information, you can visit his website, mark-guarino.com. Mark will be speaking tonight with Robin Wheeler, a local writer from St. Louis. Her journalism has appeared in Riverfront Times, St. Louis Magazine, 11 Magazine, among others, while her essays have been included in the anthologies Knives and Ink and the St. Louis Anthology. Her poetry has been selected for the Woody Guthrie Poets Readings and Anthologies since 2018, and her book about Woody Guthrie is forthcoming.
Someday.
One of these days, yeah. Without further ado, everyone, thank you, and help me welcome our readers.
Thanks. All right. Yeah, are we going to do the mics?
We don't have these.
We can hear
It's totally up to you.
You can hear me?
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're a small group, so it seems like overkill. Okay, Mark, thank you for coming down from Chicago.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah. I got my copy of the book late last week and have been plowing through it. It is so readable, so meticulously researched that you guys are going to love this book. Trust me. You just fall into it and it runs with you. In going into it, I was a little bit skeptical, and I feel like I know music. I'm pretty well versed in it. And even I was going to Chicago and country. Okay. This isn't what I was expecting. And I was preparing my arguments, and then I started reading like, no, you got it. I had no idea. Absolutely no idea. What brought you to writing this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a valid response, and that's the same response when I first asked people or told people I'm interested in reading this book, and I got a lot of puzzled looks back to me. I mean, what really got me started, I was a music critic in the 90s for a paper in Chicago called the Daily Herald, and I started around 1996. And little did I know that looking back, it really was sort of the height of this really creative and exciting time in Chicago, where there were bands and artists and musicians moving there to be a part of a scene that had country music played a big part of it. There were musicians who were around my age or somewhat older who were kind of recording records there. It just became this nexus of these amazing artists that later, a decade or two later, are now kind of mainstream. And what we would call Americana music. Back then it was called alt country, and every decade it's a different sort of name. Country rock was one of the names back many decades ago, people might recognize. And so I got really into that scene. I really loved the music, and I loved I grew up sort of under the influences of the baby boomer generation, where I learned so much about the 60s and the 70s, of Woodstock, the San Francisco psychedelic scene, Greenwich Village, New York punk, all these sort of segmented times that kind of I learned about, and I loved that music. And I remember thinking, feeling like my generation didn't really have anything that I could sort of recognize at the time that had, to me, relevance and sort of that excitement around it. And then I realized that I was actually living in a time where it actually was happening, and it's very different now. So once I got into that music, I started to kind of see threads backwards, and I started to see that everything that was happening at that time in Chicago really was threaded back to 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And that was the greatest discovery of writing this book. It's all these kind of disparate times over really 100-year period. But I was able to kind of see, and I really try to emphasize at the end of chapters and the beginning of chapters, that there's certain characters who would kind of kept showing up, certain organizations that kept kind of pushing things, bringing coalescing scenes, and also sort of a sense of reinvention of country music that had kept going on throughout the years. And so it's sort of a long-winded answer to your question, but that's kind of really, it kind of came alive before me, that I thought there's something here that's really worth looking at.
Absolutely. I've had similar thoughts about St. Louis, and I mean, the two cities were very connected.
Yeah,
in that
absolutely.
mid-90s.
Yeah.
And we'll get to that. I made a list just from the first two chapters of firsts, country music firsts, that you mentioned in the book. The first country radio show with WLS Barn Dance, first country star, Bradley Kincaid, Bill Monroe's first recordings. Bluegrass was first recorded in Chicago. I had no idea.
On Michigan Avenue, believe it or not.
Yep.
And they're right at the Wrigley Building in Michigan Avenue, right next to the Chicago River.
The first recording of I Want to Be a Cowboy's Sweetheart, which, I mean, people are still playing that one today. The first million-selling female band, was it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Roy Acuff recorded the Wabash Cannonball in Chicago. And the first all-country radio station outside of Nashville.
Yeah.
And that's just a handful. And those were all things that I went, whoa, I had no idea. I'm in Chicago all the time. I live, 4.5 hours down the road, and I had no idea. Why is this history so quiet, so well hidden?
It's kind of boggled my mind too. I couldn't believe, and there's even more stuff that I would kind of move forward that Chicago intersected with the development of this music over time. I think that part of it is that the arbiters of culture in Chicago aren't aware of it. That's one thing. It goes back really, really far. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, Nashville as sort of the epicenter of country music industry, that really became relevant more in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And so the stuff you're talking about kind of preceded that, and the story kind of went in this direction and moved forward. Mm-hmm. And Chicago kind of forgot, more or less, where it really came from. Mm-hmm. One thing I mentioned in the introduction is that one of the frustrating things about being a music journalist in Chicago is that Chicago does a terrible job of recognizing its own cultural history. And so we know of Chicago as the centerpiece or center place of gospel music and blues music and jazz music, all these important people from there. But Chicago's done a terrible job in sort of recognizing that. So cities like St. Louis, you guys have a blues museum. I did a story for Chicago Magazine about the opening of the St. Louis Blues Museum and arguing why Chicago's never had one. And New Orleans and Memphis and Nashville. But Chicago, the interest really wasn't there politically to sort of embrace all that music. So if it's that way towards those music, towards the stuff we're talking about in the book, there's like no chance whatsoever.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, and we have some of the same down here. I mean, the reason we have the National Blues Museum is because the Grammy Museum picked St. Louis.
Yeah.
It wasn't something that St. Louis said, we're going to build this. It was brought to us.
Yeah.
I live in Belleville, and I have friends who have worked for the Chamber of Commerce in recent years, and they have tried to get something, just getting Jeff Tweedy into the Belleville Hall of Fame. And the reaction and the response has been, he's too young.
Oh my gosh, wow.
He is eligible for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but not the Belleville Hall of Fame.
Right.
So, it's that Midwest aw shucks, I think.
Kind of is that,
you know.
John Prine, so his house, he grew up in a small industrial, kind of a working class suburb of Chicago that actually I grew up next to. So I knew like where his references were so great because all those early songs were from this. I was like, and that's one of the discoveries in the book, like of that terrain there. His childhood home's still standing, but there's really nothing, and somebody's just living in it.
Yeah.
But nobody. His brother still lives in the town.
Wow.
So Dave Prine, who taught him guitar, who's in his 80s now, is a great, sweet person. I interviewed him for this book, and he lives in town. But even Maywood, Illinois, won't recognize that John Prine from there. So I think there's always been a kind of a weird tension between public officials and culture. It's very rare that they kind of come into one, and oftentimes they just, when I found, at least with Chicago, is that when they think of the arts, they think of the fine arts. They think of the nonprofit arts. They think of ballet companies, and they think of symphony orchestras. But the music in this book and the blues and everywhere else, that music comes from bars and saloons and from informal gatherings, and so that music is kind of tough for them to kind of really recognize as somewhat important because it's not a high art, and it doesn't take public money. So the discussions about art within the city council meetings is always about funding the arts, but you don't really fund bars,
right?
Where a lot of the creativity comes. We fund bars,
right?
But public money doesn't. So I think that is also kind of a part of it too. Yeah.
Well, you lead right into two other things I wanted to talk about, and it pains me to skip over so much of this book. It's just that there is so much in it, and we're limited on time tonight, so you guys are really just getting the tip of multiple icebergs here. I love the chapter about Uptown and what happened there from the 50s, late 40s, post-war, through the revitalization in the 80s, and learned so much from that. And having spent a lot of time in that neighborhood, was just blown away. The fact that you referenced both John Prine and Dale Watson sitting in Northside Chicago bars as children with their fathers just is astounding to me.
Yeah.
And yet it makes perfect sense.
Yeah. So there's a story in the book where John Prine told me that his dad was from Kentucky, as he's always talked about, and his family is sort of the archetypal story of people from the kind of upland part of the South moving to Chicago for jobs. It's the other migration to Chicago. So over a period of time, I think the population of the South declined by half because there were no jobs, and so everyone was moving north to big cities like Chicago and St. Louis. And so but the culture was still there. Didn't mean they gave up the culture and the music. And John Prine, his dad would take him to Cubs games, and he told me a great story of being taken to bars on Clark Street, and he said, here's an early life lesson. When you come to a bar like this, you order 2 beers, one to drink and the other to hit somebody over the head with the fight starts. And I thought, that's great. I mean, it's sort of it really did capture, because the Uptown was, in the roaring 20s, it was this great neighborhood with these beautiful buildings, and gorgeous theaters that are still alive today. But after the crash, it went into decline. And so it became a destination point for people moving up here. Slumlords took over properties. They divided apartment buildings into, so you might have one gorgeous apartment building that you divide up into 3 units. You had people also moving there who had never lived in a city before. And so it was loud, it was very violent. And also, so you have all that, the poor conditions, and then you have the police and the sort of harassment, and the city eventually wanted to push these people out for urban renewal. So within all that, there were songwriters and there were musicians living there, and you had what were equivalently of storefront honky-tonks. So you had bars that were essentially the equivalent of a honky-tonk in the South, but they had music in there. And so it was, if you go through Uptown today, you don't really see any of that. There's one bar left, which is great. It's funny, in the book, it's called Carol's Pub. And it's on Clark Street, just about a mile down from Wrigley Field. And what's so great about it is that I'd written its obituary in the book. It was going to close because Carol, the owner, couldn't pay the taxes anymore. And so it was going to be the last. So everyone was writing the obituaries, the last honky tonk in Chicago was closed. Luckily, a business owner who owned a bunch of bars in downtown Chicago recognized the potential. He bought it, paid all the back taxes, and cleaned it up. So it's got better food. The bathrooms are nicer. But country music is back in Uptown at this bar, so it's great. It's like that's the one little linchpin of what that neighborhood really was.
Well, and here's where I've heard about Carol's Pub fairly recently. Wilco released an album about a year ago, Cruel Country, and they did a night with 3 sets at Carol's Pub last October.
Yep.
They announced it that morning, and people lined up, sold out all 3 sets.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's quite a return to form for that neighborhood. And
it really is. And that was a deliberate, I mean, they're the most popular band in Chicago. They released a record that has the word country in the title. Sort of the narrative is to kind of return to country music. And so they did kind of a special show, a couple shows you mentioned, in this little bar that fits maybe like 150 people. So it was great to see them kind of recognize, kind of bring attention back to that.
yeah, as I was reading that chapter, I'm like, are we getting to Carol's Pub? Am I putting, boom, okay, I just put, this makes sense now. I get this. That's the perfect place for them to have done that. And it's just this quiet little nod to the history. And since we brought up Wilco and Jeff Tweedy, because we're in St. Louis, we have to talk about that connection. Because there are still some people down here who are a little upset that he moved to Chicago 30 some odd years ago.
Right.
I don't know. I've looked at the history of Uncle Tupelo because, like you, I was there. I was at the University of Missouri Columbia, and they were just this band from the St. Louis area out in Belleville that came in, and I grew up in a rural area. I couldn't wait to get to school to have access to punk rock, and I was homesick, and I missed country that I never wanted to hear again. And then all of a sudden, my freshman year, there's this band that's like, they're in my head. They're in my head and they're in my soul. They're playing these 2 totally different types of music. Could that have happened anywhere other than the Midwest, do you think? With this history that you've dug into, what do you see? How did that come together at this time when we were growing up, and so many of us here were growing up?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of bands in the 80s were kind of, I could be here for hours talking about the underground rock scene of the 80s. But, there were bands that just didn't really feel like what they were interested in, or they weren't represented by what was on the radio. And so they were kind of making their own music. And it was it was the great independent music scene that kind of developed out of that. And I think that at the same time, like, those kids grew up with country music in their home and folk music in their home. And so it's undeniable that music's it's going to seep into what they did. And I found it so, but again, the idea of like not presenting the music as a museum piece, like I'm going to recreate the songs the way they were in the 1920s or the 30s, but I'm going to do something different with it, I think is sort of a natural inclination of someone who's in their 20s and wants to like maybe upset people or just kind of really challenge sort of like, does this music, do these songs have relevance today? And the way they kind of do. I mean, the songs are about hard times. Basically, that's like the overall things. And I think that at the time in the 1980s, the economy wasn't really that great for people living in the Midwest. And so all those messages from those songs, like, they were relevant. And so the way they sang the songs was maybe completely contemporary, but and then of course they made original music out of it as well. in the book, I talk about there are bands in other cities that kind of a similar inclination. And so it wasn't like Uncle Tupelo from Belleville was the only band, but they were the band that really got the most attention because they were signed to a very big label, and they had two frontmen that seemed very different from each other. So they were kind of a compelling, sort of like they were a compelling band. You know, they weren't just like a band. There were some interesting individuals in it, so I think that sort of like coalesced this whole scene around it, and really helped. So when Jeff Tweedy moved to Chicago, and he formed a second band, Wilco, they really did become. I think like every scene, if you look at the history of popular music, in every scene, there's always going to be one or two bands that are going to kind of be right there, and everything kind of circles around them. They help kind of create a bigger scene, and that they really did that in Chicago.
Looking at this, marriage of country and punk, it really picks up the modern idea that thematically is running throughout your book with outsiders, with the music that was being made 100 years ago in Chicago, being made by people who migrated from the South, who were poor, and who did not fit in Chicago. When you look at what was happening in Uptown, and I cannot remember her name now, the horrible muckraking journalist.
Yes, Norma Browning.
Norma Browning, who wrote absolutely horrible things about poor Southern migrants who were living in Uptown. You look at that, and you look at how these groups of Southern migrants came together with the Black Panthers and with the Puerto Rican gangs and formed the Rainbow Coalition. I mean, these were all marginalized groups who were using music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, the theme, I think, of the book is like reinvention, as I mentioned earlier. And like anyone, there's a little cat.
Oh,
That's brilliant. Bookstore with the cat.
Yes,
All right.
of course.
I love it. Hey, buddy. So, no, I think that one of the themes, of course, in pop music reinvention, that's what pop music is all about. It's taking somebody ordinary and they become somebody else, and then they do it really successfully. That you forgot about who was in the past, and they free to do, become like who they are. And it started with the WLS barn dance, because you had poor, basically people from Appalachia who came up who were talented. They brought the music they learned from their within their family inside their house, and they were hired by this radio show to sort of take on different name, a different backstory. The one thing the WLS radio, the barn dance did, it was a national broadcast, and it was the first country music broadcast. And what they did was they really set the blueprint for marketing music commercially. Music and epic, we think we're so marketed to every second of our lives, we forget that there was a time when that didn't exist. People listened to music, either they played it in their homes, they listened to maybe early radio, but they weren't, it wasn't a commercialized thing. And the WLS barn dance did that and set the template for it. And so it reinvented, it created all these characters. And these characters became huge over decades, and they toured. And also now you have road shows, and now you have recordings, and now they go to Hollywood and they make movies. It became this thing that was larger than life. And that theme kind of continues down the phone. Maybe talking about John Prine. His first record, he's leaning against a bunch of hay bales.
Yeah.
And he said that he had never seen hay in his life. But they reinvented him sort of as this like rustic guy, because he had a twang in his voice because his father had a twang.
Right.
And so, so you kind of see that throughout, and then into the era where we're talking about with kind of punk rockers adopting country music, they kind of create sort of a new thing. They kind of there's bands at the very end of of the book that kind of take electronic music and they try to meld it with like very old music from the 1920s, and to kind of create something new. And so it's sort of like, I think like St. Louis, I think Chicago was has always emerged as a place where you can experiment really freely, and it was kind of this incubator city. And so you saw that in the jazz world for sure, and all these other genres. And in Chicago, that's what was happening. But I think people didn't really see it because it was always under this, at least the later music, always under this umbrella of indie rock. And that's such a big umbrella that it kind of whitewashes everything together.
Right. Well, and even with indie rock, you're just leading into all these things I wanted to discuss anyway.
All
So, but yeah, the indie rock umbrella, especially in the 90s, where you do get this blending where you have groups that sound like Pavement, Guided by Voices, and then you've got bands like Uncle Tupelo coming in, sound with this country bass, and they're all playing at lounge acts.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that.
So there was a rock club in Chicago that was actually a woman-owned rock club too, which I think is very, very unique. Still is very unique. That again, it was just like in Chicago, it's a storefront, and so it's a storefront club. It's not a theater, and it became sort of like this ground zero for all these bands to go there. And I think like what makes some music venues different from other ones is that do the musicians hang out there when they're not playing? And lounge acts became that. Yeah. So musicians would go there, even if they weren't going to be playing, they'd go there to check out other musicians. And so people meet each other. And so it became sort of this like, again, kind of incubator for all these bands to sort of meet each other, collaborate, record with one another, other things kind of grow out of it. And it was a very short period of time. That club wasn't open for very long. And it was driven out by gentrification, which is another kind of theme of the book. Every time there was something very successful, the city of Chicago found a way to get rid of it. That kind of happened all for decades through Chicago. And so lounge acts in the 90s was really that place where all these bands kind of came out of it, because it was that place where other musicians hung out at.
Yeah. Well, and I'm glad you brought up the fact that it was woman-owned. One of the women being Susie Miller Tweedy, who is Jeff Tweedy's wife.
Right.
So you get into this whole familial community.
Right.
Literally.
Yeah.
And I love the part in the book where you interviewed Susie, and she talked about how they never hired security. They never, as she put it, they never hired any nomex to, bust heads. They just acted like moms.
It is true. It is true. I always remember, this place, it was a place, the capacity probably was like 150 people, but there would be like 300 people in that place. And there would be, my image of that place was always, there was one waitress whose name I don't remember at all. I never do. But I always remember her, somehow she made her way to that crowd holding her tray, and nothing ever fell off. But I was like, that, there should be an Olympic sport, and she should be the gold medal winner of that. It was a very, so on good nights like that, it was very crowded. And the other thing is that like they just let people come in and do their own thing. And I think that's also kind of a big part of just like, how kind of going back to like music outside the fine arts really is kind of created in bars. And how does that happen? It happens if you're just given the freedom to do it. Right. Even if it may not sound right or not sound polished or not sound perfect, it's like you're just allowed to do it. And I think that was a place among a few other places over time that allowed people, songwriters, to stay put and just do what you do. And something really incredible may come out of it. And of course it did. And there was a bar in the 70s called the Earl of Old Town, which did that for all the singer-songwriters in the 70s in Chicago. There was a bar called the Quiet Night that did that during that same period of time. And so there's a bar right now called the Hideout, which kind of took the mantle of lounge acts. When lounge acts closed, things kind of moved over there. So I think that's sort of like, it's very, you can see music in a lot of different venues, but it's very rare that a venue gives performers that license.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and even when you have the owners opening up their homes and letting bands crash there,
right.
that was something that happened with lounge acts too. And again, that whole familial community, it was tight.
Yeah.
You mentioned bars being the place where songwriters worked, and that being the one place. That was not the one place. We have to talk about Old Town School of Folk.
Right.
Absolutely. That's a must.
So the Old Town School of Folk Music started in 1956 or 7, I think, or 57, and so it's operating today. It's the oldest. It's a very strange place. I don't know how to describe it. It's a venue, it's a school, but it's really, I guess you'd say, it's the oldest, it's the longest running folk music school of its kind nationally, which sounds a little silly, but because that's more than just folk music. But it was so vitally important during that time. It was the height of the folk revival, when there were people, middle-class people essentially, were discovering music that wasn't middle class, music that kind of came from the South, blues music, Appalachian music, and they're also they were discovering recordings that were recorded in the 20s and 30s. So there was this it was a backlash against rock and roll, and so you had all these kind of educated middle class people who just really they were turning to simpler music played with guitars. That seems really kind of quaint today, but at that time it was very novel and new. People did not have guitars in their home in the Chicago suburbs, and so the school opened as a way to sort of like teach music, but teach it in a way that wasn't the conservatory method. Before, if you wanted to go learn guitar, you'd find a master, and you would have a one-on-one thing with them. At the Old Town School, they developed a method that really was communal learning. It was everybody in a room like this getting together, and it was about the song. It really wasn't about your performance of the song. You could be a terrible singer, but you will learn how to like present. You will learn these songs together, and that amazingly is still going on today.
Yeah.
The Old Town School was. It's a great story because through the decades, the Old Town School managed to kind of keep the music alive when. Like in Greenwich Village, we always hear about, but Greenwich Village only lasted a couple of years and it was dead. The folk scene had a second folk boom in Chicago in the 70s with all these folk clubs, and there was really the Old Town School that helped foster that because people took lessons there. John Prine took lessons there and learned how to play guitar there, most famously. And it was founded by 3 people who were so improbable they would never have met each other before. There was a woman named Mark Guarino who was a homemaker in suburban Oak Park. It was a young 20-something guitarist from the West Coast named Frank Hamilton. And it was a man in his 60s called Win Strachey, who had a whole life before this as he and Studs Terkel formed a theater group that performed at labor union. He was very much involved with the kind of radical labor left of decades earlier. And they formed the school together because they all had this kind of shared, they saw there was a need for it, and they met at a place called the Gate of Horn, which was a nightclub. It was the first nightclub in the U.S. to present folk music. Because if you think of nightclubs, would have jazz and comedians in the 50s, and so they actually had people playing guitars and singing folk music. And so yeah, they opened their doors and still continue today. One thing the book actually, great discovery I found is that all 3 were under surveillance by the FBI, and under heavy surveillance by the FBI, because at that time the FBI considered anybody connected with the folk music world, labor unions, the radical left. They were considered real threats to national security, which is laughable now, but it was taken seriously. And so Win Strachey's life was actually ruined by this because he lost jobs, because FBI agents would show up at his work and ask about him and say, do you know that he's a communist? And so he lost jobs. He was a children's entertainment on television. He lost all of his work. And the Old Town School was kind of his last hurrah, and it was the last 10 years really until he left Chicago. And so that's a really interesting story that at the time these sort of, again, improbable people came together because of music, a real love of music, and they created all this. If it wasn't for the Old Town School, this book would never have been written. But the U.S. government was clamping down on them and essentially harassing them in their private life. So, and all that's not even known before. His Win Stratke's daughter, who I interviewed for the book, she was completely not aware that, and I called her one day and I said, I have your dad's FBI file. And she had no idea. And so I made her a copy, yeah.
Where did you get the FBI file?
You can write the FBI and ask if you, and I was a shot in the dark against Studs Terkel, was under surveillance for decades, and you could find his FBI. I think he probably put it on the internet himself. And so I thought, well, Studs was very much involved in the Old Town School. And so I thought, well, if they were surveilling him, I wonder if so it was sort of a shot in the dark. I wrote them and I requested it, and not knowing that they had it, and it arrived. So yeah.
Freedom of Information Act is awesome.
That's right.
Was much of it redacted?
But amazingly, not really. Yeah, it was actually, they read kind of like novels too. Like the agent would go back and write up the report, and he actually had dialogue with people he interviewed, and they said this, and they said this, and they said this. It was great as a writer. It was all right there. So not a lot of it was redacted. It was crazy. Yeah, the agent's name, all that stuff was redacted to protect the FBI, but about his personal life, not at all.
Wow.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned just kind of briefly at the very beginning. And this is something else that when I approached this book, when I didn't know anything and approached this book, I was thinking, oh, this is going to be the poor white people who came up at the same time as the Great Migration that led to the Electric Blues starting on the south side of Chicago. It's just white people on the north side. And that's so not the case. The stories of integration that run throughout this book are astounding.
Yeah.
I mean, starting with the Coon Creek Girls.
Right.
And playing at the White House. And let's see, I've got my notes here. The 1937 National Folk Festival with Sarah Gertrude Knott as the founder, who was an anti-segregationist.
Mm-hmm.
And these were people who were really pushing to get Black voices and Black music out there. So it wasn't just white people making country music.
Yeah, because the idea of folk music wasn't just what we think of, like I grew up thinking folk music was just somebody with a guitar singing Woody Guthrie songs.
Right.
But the idea of folk music back then was folk culture.
Mm-hmm.
And the folk culture of America was music from African Americans, and it was music from Native Americans. It was music from all indigenous people of America.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about it, in the 1930s, it's sort of incredible that there was real interest in folk music of that time. And there were like major national folk festivals held in Soldier Field about this. And so there was, and the idea was really interesting. The idea was like the country's falling apart if we all recognize of who we are, if we sing each other's songs, it's going to bring people together. And that was sort of the idea behind the Old Town School of Folk Music too, the sort of community, the idea of community. And it's and so that sort of real, it's also kind of a lefty thing, which I think that's why it was considered a threat by the government. You didn't want any of this music kind of entering in respectable homes at all, because it kind of told the story of America, a lot of the songs. It is kind of incredible that the folk festival and all the stuff. And the university, one thing we haven't talked about is one chapter on the University of Chicago Folk Festival, which started in 1961 and is still going today. Not as big as it did, but it's still in the exact same. The template for the University of Chicago Folk Festival started in 1961, and it was the second. Newport Folk Festival is still around, but it's more or less a commercial folk festival now. They have big stars. But so that started in 1960. The same people who started Newport came to Chicago and started this the University of Chicago Festival, and it's in Mandel Hall, which is a beautiful theater on the Hyde Park campus. And the idea behind starting that festival among the students at the University of Chicago was again a reaction to pop music on the radio, of the idea of like this stuff is just irrelevant. So we need to have these music from these people who America's forgotten about. You know, we've completely forgot about all these people who recorded in the, decades ago, and bring them to Chicago and have them perform among college students.
Mhm.
And so that chapter is filled with stories, which are touching stories of these white college students writing or getting in their car, going down south and knocking on the doors of these people and inviting them like, hey, we know who you are. Could you come to Chicago in February in the middle of winter to perform in this hall? And these musicians could not believe it. So people like Sleepy John Estes, Elizabeth Cotton, Mississippi John Hurd, names that are today very famous. They were senior citizens then. And this was one of the first, really some of them was the first time they had ever performed outside of their, regional, small region. So that, and then one other thing I'll add to that is that there's a great story attached to that discovery. When researching the folk festival, I naturally went to where the folk festival has their current office. And of course, my friend Andy's here. He remembers our student office when we were at Loyola because we ran the newspaper together. And those student offices are typically filled with, they're not organized. There's papers everywhere because the students are in and out. It's not really a formal office. I went there and I found a metal filing cabinet in the corner, and in the basement. I pulled it out, and there was a folder for 1961, 1962, 1963, and there were the actual letters and sort of what are they, the mimeograph copies of the students of the time to the performers, and their letters, handwritten letters, most handwritten or typed, back to the students. And no one had ever seen them, and they're they're beautiful, elegant letters. Of people who had no education, really communicating with these University of Chicago students. So it's really, that was I was like, man, gold.
Well, and absolutely. And tying back into that integration, and why did this happen in Chicago and not in New York or Boston or any of these other cities that we tend to think of as being more northern and progressive?
Yeah, I think that, one of the reasons I think is because of its isolation. I know that's sort of a cliched answer, but I really think it's because nobody was really looking at all. There was no pressure to go become a star. There was no pressure to there was no commercial showcases there or whatever. There were just places where you could actually work. You can actually make a middle class living and do your art. And I think that sort of became, and then there was also an audience there too that was eager. And not just, if you go to Los Angeles, or other commercial towns, the audiences are generally going to be other people like you or musicians. In Chicago, there's always been a healthy support of all this stuff too. And so I think that's kind of a big part of it, is that there was not an expectation to be successful. And so that's so when no one expects you to kind of be anything, you can be anything. Really, in a big way, you can, and so I think that's sort of a big part of it, is that, and of course, all the other things is cheaper to live and a lot of work. So, yeah.
Well, and that's, you can go to your day job and make a living, and as you put in the book, at that time, make a middle class living.
Yeah. And
still make your art, and that wasn't necessarily the case in other cities.
Right.
So that brings everybody in.
Would you guys mind switching to the Q&A?
Oh, yeah.
Oh,
Alright.
perfect timing. Yes.
Perfect. Does anyone have any questions?
Actually, I've got
Go
one.
Yeah.
We were talking about when they brought all of the artists in Chicago. John Hammond did something similar at Carnegie in mid to late 30s, where he brought in blues artists and spiritual, gospel and jazz artists. Was there anybody in Chicago around that time when that was going on that was kind of the catalyst for all of this? Was there any single person, now just a handful of people?
Yeah, there were a couple. There was, maybe not in the 30s, but I think going to, there's an organization called Friends of Old Time Music, and that was in New York. And And there was a lot of dialogue between organizers in Chicago and that organization as well, to kind of bring the music to Chicago and present it. But I think the real catalyst became people. I mean, it's like Studs Terkel was a big catalyst for that stuff because he had a radio show and he had a television show, and so he would put that music. He would broadcast that music, and he was embedded in that stuff as well. The University of Chicago Folk Festival was started really with the help of a group called the New Lost City Ramblers, which were so you probably know they were a New York trio, and one of the players was Mike Seeger, who was Pete Seeger's half brother, and they were big proponents. In a way, I think of them as like bands from the 90s I knew, because they were playing all the old time songs in the 1950s in a very kind of clean, sort of like professional way for audiences. But they went to Chicago and they helped organize the first year or two of that, because they were the connectors to a lot of that music as well. And so there was a lot of dialogue between New York and Chicago in those days, because this was not happening anywhere else. You had to basically solicit help from people in other cities who were doing stuff. And so there's a lot of exchanges between New York and Chicago. And then after that, with the Old Town School, there were other people started forming little versions of the Old Town School, like Denver and Los Angeles. And so you kind of you saw it sort of ripple up from there. Yeah.
Edward.
So, looking at your chapter outlines, I just picked up the book, so I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward. But it looks like you're getting into how, when we get to the turn of the century in Chicago, the degree to which, country, folk, all that starts informing in a reinvention sort of way. Can you speak to briefly how you saw the role of folks like Jay Bennett, Billy Bragg, when they were approached to bring the Woody Guthrie lyrics to a new audience?
So I think that those Mermaid Avenue records, and these were records, people who don't know, were records that Woody Guthrie lyrics that were unused. The band Wilco, and Jay Bennett was in Wilco, and a British singer-songwriter named Billy Bragg created music for these unused lyrics, and they were very successful records. Those records, I think, were like a catalyst. If there was a high point of that time, it was those records. And I think that helped get people's attention, not just to Woody Guthrie, but to other reissues. One thing in the book I talk about, it was the height of the CD reissue. CDs were still kind of relatively new in the 90s, weirdly enough, to think about it. And all this music that people had forgotten about, that were lost on records, were being reissued during that time. So you had like Robert Johnson box sets, and the Smithsonian box, the Harry Smith box, and a bunch of other music that Charlie Poole and all these old time performers were suddenly rediscovered during that time. And I really, in the book, I talk about the Mermaid Avenue records, and I kind of put them in that category because people had, even though it wasn't a reissue, it was sort of a rediscovery of Woody Guthrie for people really who just knew him as maybe a children's singer or This Land Is Your Land. And so if you're 27, it's like, wow, who is this guy? Because the songs were not, they were kind of like playful and silly, but they were really like great pop songs they were making too. And I think that goes back to sort of like they were reinventing Woody Guthrie in such a brilliant way to make him really accessible. I would go to parties and I would hear those songs in the background. I would go to people who were listening to that stuff, not as an academic studying Woody Guthrie, but as like, this is really great music to, I'll put Radiohead on and I'll put on Woody Guthrie, or whatever, So I think it really fits into that. Yeah.
Well, and with my experience, I have this manuscript about Woody Guthrie and have researched in the Woody Guthrie archives, and I came to that because of those albums.
Yeah.
It was,
right. So it's a great example.
I didn't come to Woody Guthrie through Bob Dylan like most people in our age bracket and older. I came to Woody Guthrie through The Clash, Bruce Springsteen, and Wilco.
Yeah.
And those Mermaid Avenue albums were the ones that just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And opened up this entire folk world that I didn't know existed, and this was happening in Chicago.
Yeah. Even if you didn't even care about Woody Guthrie, they were just great. It was just great music.
Oh, yeah.
You know? So yeah.
I mean, like a bulk of what became Mermaid was the stuff that was cut at king size in Chicago. Billy wanted to redo it overseas, and they're like, no, we kind of like what we did.
Yeah. Right. And also the first show that they did, Wilco and Billy Bragg really did together, was in Chicago at a festival called the Guinness Floss, sponsored by Guinness Beer, and a race course in the Chicago suburbs. Was really one of the only times that they actually performed those. I think they performed it the week that record had come out, the first record, and they recorded it, or they played it live, really for the first time to a Chicago audience, and really never again, did he and the band kind of come together and do that. So that was a special moment too.
Yeah.
Any other questions? You have maybe one last question you want to end the night with?
Oh, so what's next for country and folk in Chicago? You mentioned the Hideout, so what's happening now?
Well, it's interesting. There is now that I'm an old person officially, but really there's when I notice that there's bands coming up that I don't really have a relationship to, and I'm kind of watching. There has been a lot of musicians moved out of Chicago because they've been very successful, which is a very typical thing. And so there was sort of been a kind of a new generation of bands. There's a really healthy bluegrass scene in Chicago that I did not see coming at all. One thing I talk about in the book is the band Special Consensus, a band that started in 1975, and they were the first bluegrass band outside of the South. There had never been bluegrass. Again, one of those things you think of. This bluegrass band in every corner. The Special Consensus was a band of Chicago players, and they're still around today. And they're going to do an event with me at the Chicago Public Library in the summer. And so they really kind of help sort of inspire a lot of bluegrass bands that are there. There's some really great singer-songwriters. The Hideout's still going. And so it's a different scene. I'd say, does it have the same energy as really that time we're talking about? I'd say no, because I don't think that you just can't replicate time at all. And I think that the 90s also was a time where there was a lot of great music journalism. Every daily newspaper had a full-time critic or a bunch of people writing about that stuff. That's essentially gone. And so I just think that but a lot of these people are still around and are still making music. I was looking at this spring, Robbie Fulks, who did the forward to my book. He's got a bluegrass record out. He's got a new record, the Waco Brothers. It's I think around for 30 years. They have a new record out.
They're going to be in town for Twine Fest.
Oh, okay.
In June.
There you go.
They're one of the headliners.
And so a lot of these, and Andrew Bird has a new record out, and Caliphone has a new record out. So all these bands from that are in the book are still going and putting out new interesting music. So I found that the music really does endure. So
one of the things that I think is interesting that I've seen happening up there is the Hideout has been having Cosmic Country Nights, and one of the musicians who plays there is Case Oates, and she's actually from suburban St. Louis, and her boyfriend and bandmate is Spencer Tweedy.
Oh, okay.
Jeff and Susie Tweedy's son.
See, the continuum is there.
The continuum is still there. The
Yeah.
next generation is in place,
Yeah.
and he gets right about that now.
I know. Yes.
All right.
And happily so.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming out. Can we give it up for the readers one more
Thank
time?
you so much. Thanks for coming out.
We have books for sale at the front, and you can get them signed if you'd like, personalized if you're interested.
Bring it on. Thank you.
very much.
Oh man, thanks
If you
so
would
much.
please.
Thank you.